Hey everyone, Arbor617 here from Black Thousand Studios with the final episode of our Minecraft animation tutorial series using Blender. In this episode, I'll be covering the final touches that I did with the scene since last episode. I'll be showing you how to add motion blur. We'll be rendering out our video as a movie, and we'll be editing it together in our video editor. And finally, we'll create the thumbnail for it, and then I'll give you an overview of everything we did, and I'll conclude the series. So getting started, I actually realized while doing the final touches on the scene that I'd actually skipped one of the render settings. That is my bad. This is something that, again, I just kind of always had on and I forgot about it, and that is the clamp direct under sampling. And basically, if we look into our scene, let's go to an interior shot, and I'll be covering some of the stuff I did in the scene in a moment, but if we take this just random indoor shot here, let's render this out real quick. And what you'll notice is, first of all, the sampling is low, just because I have it set low, but you get these strange, very bright little highlights known as fireflies. So if I go into another slot, let's go to slot 5, if we change the clamp indirect to 1, and now render it, we will see that that got rid of all the fireflies. If I jump back and forth, everything is the same, other than those little bright pixels. So what I would recommend doing is go into the default Blender cycle scene that we set up in the first episode, and change the clamp indirect to 1, and save off the settings. And then one thing that isn't always necessary but might show up that you might have run into is something I also believe I ran into, is if you have any shots like perhaps something like this. Let's render this out real quick. One thing that you might see if you're rendering out something with a bunch of transparency is something like here in the grass. As you start going back further in the grass, you'll start getting strange the grass will turn black. If you have mist, it'll actually turn into the color of the mist. You can see a bunch of it back here, and it's a little artificial. And the solution to that problem is under light paths. We initially set the transparent max and min to 8 and 8, which works normally. However, in those shots where you're looking through a bunch of grass or pretty much just grass, you might want to change these to something like 16 and 16. And let's render it out again. And as you can see, it cleared up all the grass. If I switch between them, we have the one which kind of messed up as it gets through transparency, and then the cleaned up version. However, you'll notice it actually increased the render time a little bit, from 17 seconds to 20 seconds. So what I would recommend is I would only keep those values there on shots where you have that problem. You can always right click these, insert keyframes, and have it jump back down to 8 and 8 for all the other shots. For this animation I might just leave them both at 12 for the whole animation, but you'll probably want to keyframe that up to 16 or even more on shots where you have the problems. Otherwise leave it something around 8 or something. Anywho, so the transparent bounces will help that if you have that issue. And you should definitely pretty much always leave clamp indirect on 1. So let's get back into the tutorial series. So you'll notice I've done a bunch of changes since last time. First of all, I went back and kind of redid all the opening shots, wanted to spend some more time getting better camera shots and kind of planning it out. And as I'm kind of scrubbing through it, you'll see everything. Some other things I did is that, as mentioned in the last episode, I talked about my personal channel and how it has a bunch of other tutorials. You'll notice the water is actually the cool looking photorealistic water, and if you watch, I have a tutorial on that on my personal channel on water. Also, I have the grass now wiggling. You'll see it kind of blows in the wind, as well as the leaves, just to kind of create a little bit of kind of wind motion. There's also a tutorial on my personal channel for that, and also the character walking. As I mentioned, that's kind of a whole thing on its own, so I spent some time on it, made him look like he walks out a little better. There's a tutorial on my channel for that. I'll have all these tutorial links in the description. However, you may want to just check out the whole playlist on my channel. One of the other things I did was the depth of field. As you can see right here, I have this little camera focus, and I have also a tutorial on my channel for that. So it allows us to get something like so. So we have the character's face in focus, but the carrots are out of focus. And apart from the little bonus things I did in the tutorial, there's simple animation cleanups. Have things like the character blinking, his eyes move around, he's all animated. And if I start kind of just scrubbing through it, we'll see I added something like the character picking up an item. I told you how in the previous tutorial briefly how there's a hoe here. Right when he touches it, it disappears. Then the one in his hand appears. He picks it up. And I'll actually be giving you the scene file in the description, and I'll let you actually download the scene if you want to kind of look through it all and see how it's all set up. One of the things that I was debating whether or not to include in this tutorial series is actually one of the most heavily requested things is particles, as right here we have him throwing a bunch of carrots into the chest, and I did that with a particle emitter. There's actually all these carrots are being emitted from this little emitter right here. However, I decided not to cover the actual particles in this tutorial series simply because I feel like in order to explain particles properly, it would require a full tutorial and that would just take way too long. So keep an eye out on my personal channel. I'll probably be eventually doing a full particle tutorial, but I wanted to at least leave this in the scene because this, because the scene is going to be downloadable. If you want to kind of reverse engineer it, see how I set that up, I'd at least leave it in here. And maybe just one or two more things to mention about this scene is the lighting, because that's one thing I talked about, that you kind of you'll adjust lighting as you start animating and as you start rendering things out. One thing you'll notice is I had to add a point light in the scene. It kind of moves around a little bit. There it is right now. There's a point light to help light the room up. I was finding that in the inside it was just too dark trying to light the room with these two glowstones. So there's a light, and the light is always kind of positioned so that it's always illuminating his face. When he comes in, it's over here. When he goes over to the table, it moves closer to this area. When he's bringing down a recipe book, it moves closer to the bookshelf to kind of keep his face lit. And even down here, when he's looking into the chest, the light actually moves all the way down here. That way it'll keep his face lit if I render that shot. And while that's rendering, not only did I keyframe the position of the light to move around, but we also changed the strength to different values depending on different shots. Because right now it's right next to his face, so I have to keep it kind of dim. But we just want to be able to see our characters. If you don't really do shot-by-shot lighting, you'll find in certain shots that a lot of things are very dark. So let's get into the next thing, is the motion blur. Let's find a shot where there's a lot of motion. Here's one where he swings his hoe down. So let's go right to about here where he's swinging his hoe. And we'll go into a new slot. Let's go to slot 1. We'll hit render. So it seems cool how it is. However, we can make it a little better. So let's go to slot 2. And there's a few ways you can add motion blur. One of the ways you may have seen is under the render settings, there's a motion blur option. If you use this option, and I render this into slot 2, this will actually apply the motion blur directly as you render. However, one thing I've noticed is, it seems like the settings are a little bit high right now. Let me actually decrease the motion blur a little bit. So I decreased it to 0.2. But the problems I seem to have is that it increases the render time a lot in the scene. Sometimes I'm talking about like a whole lot. Here is without motion blur, took 13 seconds. Here is with motion blur, it took 18 seconds. It's 50% longer to render using that. So I've usually stayed away from this motion blur. However, some people might argue it looks a little better. However, for the way I use it is good enough for me, and it's a lot quicker. Let's go into slot 3. And over here on the right, we're going to click on a new thing we haven't clicked on before. Actually, yes, we have. We clicked on it for the mist. It was the render layers option thing. Then we're going to go down here to the passes. This is where we added our mist pass a while ago. But now we're going to add a vector pass. And if I render it out, nothing changes. It just goes back to the way we had it in the first shot. The render time was a tiny bit longer. It was from 13 seconds to about 14.5, well 13.5, 14.5, so added 1 extra second. However, now if we go into compositing, we can move these composite in the viewer over a little bit. Let's Shift A, we're going to create a vector blur node. We're going to put it in between the composite and the add. Then we'll just connect the vector blur to the viewer. And now that we added that vector pass, we'll see a speed option in our render layers way over here. So we're going to pull the speed all the way across into the speed over here. And we're going to pull the Z all the way across into the Z over here. And then it should update. And then we can decrease the blur amount maybe to 0.6 or something. For our animations, we usually do around 0.6 or 0.8. And here we go. You have a little bit of motion blur. You can even increase the samples a little bit. I usually also turn on the curved. Seems to make it a little bit cleaner, kind of smoothens things out a little bit. So now, if we go back to our default, and we can look at, let me re-render slot 3 with our compositing actually enabled. We now have the default with simple, the hoe sitting there, and then we have the in-render motion blur that seems a little noisy and increases render time a bunch. Then we have the one that's not nearly as crazy as the other motion blur as far as render times, but it still looks good enough. We can clearly see there's motion. It looks a little better than here's the original without motion blur, and here's our new version with our vector blur. However, one problem you'll notice with vector blur is if we go to the end of any shot, let's just pick a random shot right here, the first frame of a new shot. If I were to render this out right now, one problem you'll get is this. Some kind of strange warping effect, everything goes crazy, and the reason for that is, of course, the camera is cutting to a different position, so it thinks it's moving very fast. You can avoid this if I think you have a multi-camera setup. However, I still like to do single camera setups. So the way I found that fixes that best is if we go back into compositing, and down here there's a little tiny timeline. So go to the very beginning of the animation, let's go to the very first camera cut. We'll go to the very first frame, or the frame of where it cuts as we left and right arrow. We can see it going back and forth. So let's go to the first frame right before it cuts. We'll go back one more frame. So we're one frame before the cut starts. We're going to right click the blur, insert a keyframe. We're going to go forward. So now we're on the very last shot, or sorry, the very last frame of that shot. I'm going to set this to 0. And because I have auto keyframe on it, automatically set the keyframe. I'm going to go forward one more frame. So now we're at the first frame of the next shot. We're going to just click on this and click out of it because we have auto keyframe, so it'll set the key. Go forward one more frame and set it back up to 0.6. So if you didn't follow that, just to kind of go over it again more briefly, we have it going along. We keyframed at 0.6, then we keyframe down to 0, keyframe 0 again, then keyframe back up to 0.6. So basically we want to set the motion blur to 0 on both frames right, before and at the beginning and the end of the shots where it cuts. And that will allow us to basically on those frames where it goes crazy, we just turn off the motion blur entirely. And I was initially worried that people would notice it. However, this has been like that in all of our animations and no one's ever pointed it out. If you actually slow any of our animations down frame by frame, you'll notice the beginning and end of every shot has no motion blur. And if we click on the vector blur node and now go into animation, we'll see that in our dope sheet, if we have the isolate selected on, because in the compositor we have the vector blur selected, we'll see it right here. If we go to the beginning of the timeline, there are those 4 keyframes we just set for the blur. If I unselect everything in the viewport, select our camera, we can see that, okay, we've got that lining up directly over the camera cut frame. And what's handy is, first of all, double check to make sure you have the ghosting button enabled, because this is where the ghosting button can sometimes prevent problems. But if we just box select these, let me also turn on the screencast. Notice that I forgot to turn it on. There we go. If we box select those 4, and I call it blur canceling. It's canceling out the blur. If we box select those, we can start going along. Shift D, put them over the next camera cut. Make sure they're perfectly aligned. Shift D, and you will continue doing so for all the camera cuts. It might sound a little boring, but having motion blur is certainly worth it. And I still personally think one camera shot is just a little easier to deal with than multi-cameras. So that's that. Now we can just double check that all the camera shots have the anti-motion blur right over the different cuts, which we do. So that pretty much covers it for motion blur. And next, we're finally all ready to start rendering. And technically this is something I actually probably should have explained in the animation episode. However, I wanted to kind of group it with rendering, is that there's actually a different kind of render we can do, which I'll be showing you in just a moment. But first, let's set up our output. So let's go back to our render settings, and the output section previously we left alone. What I'm going to do is open this new folder. We're going to choose where we're going to save something. I actually already have some things out here, so we'll just kind of ignore that. Just ignore that Carrots Renders folder. Let's create a new folder, and we're going to call it Draft Renders. And this is something I would highly recommend whenever you're doing animation. You want to first start by just doing like a low draft version of the animation, and we're going to name it Carrots Draft _ and the underscore is so we can have Carrots Draft _ and it will put the frame numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4 afterwards. We'll hit accept. And rather than just rendering the animation, we want to render a draft of the animation, and it's good to really render out that draft first to just check things like timing, to check things like composition, and you can start putting in music and see if the music synchronizes up to stuff. And what we can do is over here, make sure overwrite's enabled, because you may want to be rendering multiple drafts later on and you want to just keep overwriting it, is that if we click this button right here, it will render out basically the animation without actually doing all the lighting. It just shows you how it is in the viewport. I'm going to hit escape to cancel that because to save time, I already rendered this, which is why I told you to ignore this thing. I already have it kind of rendered out. But another trick is you don't want to be seeing all these little, you know, rig items and stuff all over the face. If I do a single image one, we don't want to have the draft looking like this. We want the draft to look a little nicer. So one thing right before you ever do one of these little draft render things, if we press N in the viewport, we go under the display section right next to our world background. If we turn on only render, that will hide everything but, you know, well, okay, it'll basically hide the things that don't render, which is what we want. So now we can hit this button and it'll render out a draft of our animation, which in the end will look something like this. And as you work on the animation and you change things, you want to keep kind of every so often, just get in a habit of hit the OpenGL render, let it overwrite all your old frames, bring it back into your video editor, and I'll be showing you how to bring it into your video editor in just a moment, but it's good to do drafts of animations first before doing the final render. However, when you all are ready to go, what I would recommend now is turning this overwrite button off. We're going to click on this icon, we're going to go to create a new folder, so we have our draft renders. We're going to create a new folder and then we're going to call this one Final Renders. Then we're going to click that and then we're going to change it to something like carrots final _. And the good thing about having this in a separate folder now and overwrite turned off is if I were to start animating now, sorry, not animating, if I were to hit the animation button, we'll notice it's going to start rendering into that carrots final. It'll do all the lighting and all the rendering and stuff. And every time it finishes a frame, let's let it go for a moment, it'll do the frame number 0, it finishes, and it moves on to frame number 1. And if we want to stop this at any time, we hit escape to stop it. Well, actually, let's let it finish the second frame. We'll hit escape to stop it. And if we have overwrite turned off, and we're rendering into a brand new folder we just created for the carrots final, if I were to start rendering again, you'll notice it'll skip the first frame 0 and 1 and go straight to frame 2. So you don't have to worry about resuming, you don't have to worry about finding out where you left off. In the old tutorial series I didn't really know about this, and I told you had to go into the folder and like count out where it ended up and start over. Anywho, another thing I mentioned I kind of skipped just now that I was kind of hoping you guys can understand is that be sure when you're all ready to go that you actually have your start frame and your end frame set to where you want it, because if you don't, if you have this pulled around somewhere, it'll only be running those. But anyway, as for rendering the final thing, one advice I have is be sure to go not frame by frame, go shot by shot, set your sampling a little low, and just test every shot before you're ready to do your final render. Make sure every shot has good lighting, the motion blur didn't mess up, there's no crazy depth of field set too high. I actually already did this within the last few days, so I kind of know all these shots are pretty much good. But it's good just to do a low sample test of all the shots. That way when we're all ready to go, you can just let it go overnight and stuff. And when you're all ready, you'll probably want to set up the renders to the render samples up pretty high. For this animation, I'll probably go to like 128. It's the power of 2, which is kind of nice. But you don't have to do powers of 2. It's just kind of a habit I've done sometimes. I usually keep my animations around 100 to 150, depending on if it's outdoor or indoor. And one thing to note is you can keyframe the samples. So what I might end up doing for this animation is keep it at maybe like 128 for all the outdoor shots, insert keyframe, and then for the indoor ones, I noticed it was a little noisy. I'm going to go up to 256. Oh, okay, so here's a problem I just noticed. This is actually, I'm glad I had this problem, because this is the thing that used to bother me a lot. So, see how I have the camera selected? And remember how we used to hit the up and down arrow keys to jump between the keyframes. One thing you're going to notice is it's actually, when I hit up, it jumped a frame before the keyframe. And the reason for that is in our compositing, we still have the vector blur node selected, which has keyframes. So if I unselect that, then go back to default, now if I hit the up and down arrows, it'll work correctly. I didn't know that for the longest time, and that used to bother me. So now let's go to the frame before he goes indoors. We'll set the samples to 128. Inside will be 256, we'll double it for the indoor shots. And we'll go to right before he jumps back out. and back outside it'll go back to 128. And I'd recommend if you ever have any indoor versus outdoor shots to kind of do that to keep the outdoor ones rendering a little simpler, but the indoor ones a little less noisy. So we have the sampling ready to go. We have our output. We have our, we're in the final render folder. We have the overwrite turned off because we want to be able to just kind of hit render and let it go. I would recommend letting things render overnight because as we noticed now, if I hit animation, actually let me go back into that folder and delete those little test frames that we were just putting out. Let me get rid of those because those were just a low sampled draft I was showing you as an example of something. So now it's empty, and we're going to hit save, and when you're all ready to render, you'll hit animation. You can let it go, it'll take a while, and if you ever want to stop, we can just hit escape, and when you want to resume, all you have to do is just hit animation again because we have the overwrite turned off, and it'll just pick up where it left off. But one little advice I have is, if you have any friends with good GPUs, you can have them help render. That's how we pretty much do almost all of our animations. We usually have at least 2 people render it. But before you do that, you'll have to go to File, External Data, Automatically Pack into Blend File. We want to turn that on and you'll see it packed some files. Basically, if you don't have that on and you send the scene file to someone, they'll open it and everything will be all pink and the textures don't get transferred with the file and they can't render. But now that it's packed, we can save it. And if I go into the folder again and go to our caret scene, it's 102 megabytes, which is kind of big. But if we right click it and send it to a compressed zip, it cut the size down to 23 megabytes. So you can just send this to someone over, Google Drive or Skype or something, give them the scene. And then what you can do is tell them, oh, I'll render the first half, you render the second half. So then you just tell them to change their start frame to something like 1000. So then you render, 0 to 99 or 0 to 999. They render 1000 to 2300 or something, and you can split it up that way. So we each aren't rendering a whole bunch. I'll actually be doing the rendering of the animation overnight tonight, but we can still continue without it because, as I mentioned, I actually already rendered out a draft of the animation using the OpenGL rendering. So this is the part where in the first episode I mentioned there might be a little differences depending on what video editor you have, and just brief to mention, you don't need a video editor. There is a output, we just left it as the PNG sequence for the output. There are movie files, you can render it straight into an AVI. The problem is there won't be audio or music. However, I have heard, and I'm not sure about this because I've never done it, I have heard that people can put music straight into Blender, and if you render out of some of these movies, it will render with the music in it. So you can get away without a video editor. However, as you see in a moment, having a video editor will help a lot. I use Sony Vegas Pro 12 as mentioned, so let me bring it open. And in whatever video editor you use, if you go to File, you'll probably go to something like Import. You might be able to just import media. It might ask for you to import an image sequence. In Sony Vegas, we just go to Media. And here's where I already have, we only did a little bit of draft renders today as a test. However, last night I rendered out the whole animation, so I wouldn't have to do it, right now while I'm going to do the tutorial. So I'm going to open up those. And if I click on the first one in Vegas, it gives me this option down here to open the sequence. So then all those little individual images, when I open it and, it asks me some stuff, it tries to guess the frame rate and stuff, which it was correct on. And now if I bring that in, it turned all of those all those frames into a single image sequence, which we can now move through as if it was a single movie. If I press play, it will play at real time, or not at all, because my hard drive was updating right there. I actually have a little bit of issues with my hard drive, where it doesn't really stream files from it quickly. But anyway, this is what I was mentioning earlier about rendering out a draft. So normally you'll render out drafts into your editor, you'll put in music and test it, and then later, when you're all done, all you have to do is swap out the footage for the final renders. But it's good to render these drafts because you can press play and watch it at real time, no matter what kind of computer you have, unless you have my computer with a hard drive that's not playing the frame sequence back at real time. It's just being a little bit annoying right now. But anyway, as for music, I actually use Epidemic Sound, which is a audio library that has a bunch of music. You normally have to get a subscription for it, but the network we're partnered with, the Curse Network, they have free access to all of the Epidemic Sound music. So if I, just pick a random song, combat zone doesn't sound very fitting, but if I put the song in, we can have the music playing in the background. If you're interested in Curse Network and you want to have access to Epidemic Sound, there is actually a link in the description of all the BPS videos on how to join it. Again, I would highly recommend the Curse Network because they have a lot of cool perks, such as the music library. And as for sound effects, this is something that I was contemplating whether or not to put a download link for the Minecraft sounds in the description. I decided against it simply because every new version it pretty much changes. So if you're watching this tutorial in like a month or two from when I made it, there's going to be more sounds. I would just do a quick Google search, but if we go into some Minecraft sounds, you'll probably have something similar to this. If we want to put things like, there's no horse in the scene, but if I put a little horse idling, you can drag and drop sounds, and you combine the sounds with the music, and you get your video. And when you're all done the video, depending on your video editor, you can render it out, as an actual video file, which you then upload to YouTube. And that's almost it. However, one more thing that I wanted to cover in this series is making thumbnails, because some people kind of neglect this, and yeah, you have enough information to do thumbnails on your own. However, I wanted to actually create the thumbnail for this animation, just so you can see how I set them up, and maybe I'll do like a little speed version of it real quick, so you can just see me kind of doing a speed render of the thumbnail. Whenever I do thumbnails, when I'm all done the animation, I'm ready to render it, and it's all saved off, the first thing I do is I go into the scene, and we're going to save it as a new scene. We're going to call it something like Carrot's Thumbnail. That way we can change it around without messing up the old scene. And then what I do, I go into the animation. Actually, let's hide this. I go into the animation. I turn off the isolate only selected things, and I'm going to hit A again, and we're going to delete all the keyframes, because this is going to be an image render. We don't want things moving around, so we get rid of all the keyframes, and we're going to start setting up our thumbnail. I want to pause the time-lapse for a moment and mention the next thing I'm about to do and kind of explain this. It's a good thing I explained the thumbnail making, because a cool little trick I do when making thumbnails is if we split the screen, one thing we can do on the right side, we can press the numpad 0. We can be in the camera on one scene, in one little viewport, but outside the camera in another. Let's kind of get a good view. And if we press the N and do only render, now we can see exactly what the thumbnail is going to look like, even though we're in here moving things around. So here we go, got a working thumbnail, and as I go through the different frames, actually where did I actually start this? Starting here, here's where it was initially. As you can see, I then rotated the sun around so it faces them. I put some depth of field on. Depth of field was a little bit too much, so I toned down the depth of field, put more mist in the background. Then here I actually added a point light in the scene right in front of his face, because in thumbnails it's really important to have your characters well lit. If they're kind of dark like that, you won't really have them stand out, so I added the point light to light his face up. Then I lowered down the rest of the scene a little bit, toned down the stuff a little bit, and made his, the characters stand out. There's a little bit of depth of field mist. And one thing important with thumbnails is to always try to zoom out a lot and just look at it, because this is how it's going to look on YouTube. Just make sure it still kind of holds up when you're, far zoomed out. I might even put a little bit more light on the bunny. And there we go. Here's the before. I duplicated the point light. Now the bunny is just a little bit more illuminated, which looks good. So we've got our nice thumbnail. And when you're happy, you increase the samples a bunch, and you can hit image down here, and you can save as image. We can save this off as our, Carrot's thumbnail. So luckily I already pre-edited out the sound effects and the music and some of the text and stuff. If you're curious, this is kind of what it looks like when I've completed it. We have different kind of songs that switch and fade to different music. We have all the sound effects for stepping and animals and stuff. And now that it's all edited up and everything, let's play the animation and see what we've created. So after watching that, I hope you've maybe learned that it's not quite as crazy as you think it is to create these animations. It's just a matter of learning some of these principles and spending some time on it. I'd like to overview everything we've done so far, just to really put everything into perspective before ending this series. So first, I talked about what you'd need to do Minecraft animations, specifically choosing your graphics card. Then we built our world in Minecraft once we had an idea for the animation. We downloaded Mineways and converted our world. We set up our Blender settings, and we saved off a default scene with those settings saved. We brought the world into Blender, and we applied the textures using MC Prep. I explained the basics of navigating around in Blender. We moved objects to different layers to optimize the scene performance. We did some advanced scene optimization by cutting away the unused section of the world. We brought in the sky texture, and I showed you how to rotate it around. We imported a character rig. We then set up our skin so it would work with the rig. I showed you how to import items and blocks and adjust some of the terrain. I showed you how to render the scene. We talked about ambient occlusion and adding a sunlight, as well as using objects as lights. I showed some advanced settings for vegetation materials, such as ignoring the back facing and translucency. We added the mist. We added a glow or boosh effect. We looked into previous BPS animations and how their lighting was set up. And in the animation episode, I went over a lot of different things, such as keyframing, auto keyframing, moving around character rigs, the dope sheet, parenting objects. And in this episode, I finished by showing you all the things I had done on the animation since last episode. We then went into showing you how to set up motion blur, as well as canceling out the motion blur problems at the camera cuts. I showed you how to render out your animation into frame sequences, both as the OpenGL draft versions, as well as how to set it up when you're ready to do the actual animation. I showed you briefly how to import the image sequence into your video editor, and you can put in things like sound and music. And finally, I showed you how to create a thumbnail, which you'll be using when you upload it to YouTube. So that's it, and that concludes this tutorial series. I hope you enjoyed this series. I hope you learned something from it. As I mentioned before, I'll be having the blend file available in the description if you want to download it and check it out. Again, thanks so much for watching. If you're following this tutorial series and you end up making some cool animations from it, be sure to let us know somewhere. Maybe send an email to the Black Plasma email, or message me if you have any contact with me. Also, if you're really serious about making Minecraft animations, and as you're doing this, you're just really enjoying it, and you want to do this full-time as a job, you can check out the apply page on our website. If you go to blackplazastudios.net, there is actually a 3D animator position, which we always have available in case ever anyone comes along and follows the series and learns Minecraft animation and really wants to do this as their job. We do have a few more positions available to join the Black Plaza Studios team as an animator. However, you have to be extremely dedicated and willing to learn a whole bunch of stuff on your own and be able to put together animations fairly regularly for the channel. But otherwise, I hope you just go to make some animations on your own, and I hope you enjoy it. And thanks again for watching. This is Arbiter617 from Black Plaza Studios. See you around.